Cuba. Sony cancels the interview, and Jeb Bush. I'm Mike Adekunle, and this is The Square Circle. Welcome, everyone.
Thank you for having us.
Good to be here.
Okay, so the major news this week was the change in the U.S. policy towards Cuba. President Obama announced a deal with the island nation that includes the exchange of prisoners, an easing of the travel and trade restrictions, and the opening of the U.S. Embassy in Havana. Many hailed the deal as heralding a new era in Cuban-American relations, but others said the president gave away too much leverage and essentially rewarded the Castro regime for bad behavior. Senator Marco Rubio, a Cuban American, called the deal disgraceful and promised to block it in the new Congress next year. So, James Hedrick, is the deal a good thing?
I think so. I have a hard time believing that there's anybody that would be opposed to something like this, a loosening of trade restrictions, a loosening of travel restrictions. It sort of boggles the mind that anybody would be opposed to this kind of thing. It's been 53 years of the same policy, and it hasn't worked. If you want to have any impact, if you need control over a regime, you need to have some sort of influence over them, typically in this case economic. So if you want to have any impact on the Castro regime or Cuba at all, human rights, what have you, you need to have economic ties with them, and it sort of boggles my mind that anybody would be opposed to this kind of thing, and I'm shockingly surprised it hasn't happened sooner.
Okay. Does anybody else have
Well, I don't know about that it's been, you can say it's been a total failure, because, we are a very wealthy country and they are a very poor country, and what has happened here is they have run out of benefactors. They cannot get money from the Russians anymore. They cannot get the money from the Chinese anymore. They cannot get money from the Venezuelans anymore, who, because of the decline in oil prices. One of the underlying stories here is the oil price collapse is like making all kinds of things happen quickly, short deadline stuff. And this is one of them, is that, they're out of money. And they tax the remittances. People come here, send money back to Cuba. The government takes 20% of that. One of the things in this agreement is the amount that you're allowed to remit is quadrupled. Mm-hmm. So, there's more money for the government. So it's a way for them to get money.
Well, my view is that in an administration that has served more as the third and fourth terms for Bush, this is really the biggest legacy item so far. I mean, this is a huge change in policy. And I take an opposite view from you, Brian. I think this is because I think this is pressure that has been building on the United States for a long time to do this. This was a failed policy, 50-plus years of trying to overthrow it, hundreds of assassination attempts on Castro, things like that.
Exploding cigars.
Exactly, or poisoned scuba gear. But
we still have him, but he doesn't have much.
The United States was becoming increasingly isolated in the Americas. It was being, the countries of the Americas, Latin America, was saying, you're just going to be excluded, the United States. They were saying, we're going to boycott, essentially, the next Summit of the Americas, OAS Summit of the Americas, telling them over their Cuba policy. There's been this kind of leftist revolution in Latin America that now is saying, we're not going to put up with this, with you excluding Cuba anymore from the Americas, the community of the Americas.
Well, how I look at this is in a perspective of history. Like they've already brought up before, 53 years the embargo has not worked. Its entire purpose was to help aid in the overthrow of the Castro regime, help drive them out of government, out of business, completely out of the picture. It has not worked. However, I look at this in a form of history in the sense that we've done this with other nations. We began engaging in trade with the USSR. We engaged in trade with China, with Vietnam, Saudi Arabia, many other countries that were once more powerful, more dictatorial, and more communistic than they are today. For instance, China, if we look at them today, China has made more moves towards human freedom, economic freedom, ever since we started engaging them more. Look at the success that Hong Kong has had. When you look at the USSR, when we started really loosening up the the type of relations that we had with the USSR, you saw increases in freedom with perestroika, with glasnost, with lots of other things. So I see this as a positive move to try and help get rid of the Castro regime. If the economic sanctions aren't working, which they hardly ever work, they only hurt the people, they don't hurt the state. What we should be doing is trying to engage in a policy of example and influence. If we allow more market, more trading going on in Cuba, you'll see more people bring up with power in Cuba to be able to overthrow the Castro regime and pressure them to act in the way that they should be acting. This is not a way of rewarding the Castro regime for all the bad things that they have done in the past, which have been numerous things. However, what this is actually a way to punish the Castro regime and instead bring about more freedom in the country.
Yeah, I've always said there were nine golf resorts would be New South Florida.
Yeah, the only thing I think there's, I'm trying to remember the quote, but I think it was somebody in reference to the European Union about the only thing people like more than shooting each other is making money, and this is a good way to make money.
Yeah.
And I think that, again, it's a relic of the Cold War. There's some political implications with a particular constituency, but otherwise I can't see this as anything but more U.S. influence, more trade back and forth, more money. It's going to strengthen a middle class, an economic middle class in Cuba that's going to rise, and it's going to force the Castro regime to expand, to rights to a broader section of the population.
To clarify what it doesn't do, too, and what should be the next step, is removing the embargo. The embargo still stands.
Exactly.
President
For
Obama,
most things.
despite
For some
exactly,
things,
it was loosened slightly, just like the travel restrictions were loosened slightly. But this is an embargo that the entire global community, minus the U.S. and Israel, has voted unanimously for 22 straight years condemned this embargo. It's put Cuba under tremendous strain, and the real losers here isn't the Castro government; it's the people of Cuba. So that's the next, and it's frankly our own business prospects in Cuba, as well as theirs and ours.
In fact, our own economy, in 2005, the University of Texas did a study in which it found that there are almost $5 billion lost in revenue that could be pumped into the economy if we actually were to get rid of the embargo. They're right. This deal doesn't get rid of the embargo. It does loosen some trade sanctions. It does loosen some travel restrictions. But I see it as a good move. It's a good precedent to set when we start actually talking to Cuba. Some naysayers will say, well, we can't talk to them. They're a dictatorship. They're awful. They're terrible. Well, where were you when we started trading with Saudi Arabia? It is a Cold War relic. It really should go. And not only that, I'd like to bring up that Marco Rubio is not in sync with the majority of the Cuban-American community. The majority of Cuban Americans want this type of relationship, too. They'd like to see more friendly relations between Cuba and the U.S., and I see this as the best way to go about it.
I'd like to remind the audience that you can submit your questions to our guests through our website. That's www.publicsquare.net, and we'll answer as many as we can live on air towards the end of the show. So moving on. This week, Sony Pictures canceled the scheduled release of the new film, The Interview, after apparent terrorist threats. Sony recently endured cyber attacks by hackers traced to North Korea. This week, there were new threats of violence at theaters that showed the film, a comedy that depicts an assassination attempt on North Korea leader Kim Jong-un. Many have called Sony's decision an act of cowardice and a blow to free speech. Nick Morphus, was Sony being responsible in taking the terrorist threat seriously, or did they let the terrorists win?
Well, it's funny because this has almost become a really, really funny day-long punchline when it comes to anything that happens with North Korea. Now, do I really think this is like a major blow to free speech or anything like that? Not really. It's funny because in the same day that they decided to announce that they would cancel the initial the initial release of the film on Christmas Day, it turns out the State Department also released their own statement saying that there was no credibility behind these threats. There was nothing really to worry about. I'd say, in fact, if anything, and I mean, I'm pretty sure a lot of people feel this way, this is the best way for Sony to market the movie. I mean, you have people who didn't even care about the movie before now talking about it. This is the best thing that ever happened to this movie. So this movie now is going to get great press and is going to get great viewership when it is finally released. And honestly, to call any credibility to North Korea's threats, I mean, they threaten us for everything. They were just threatening a few weeks ago. They were threatening South Korea to bomb them because they put a big shiny Christmas tree in view from the North Korean border. It's in South Korea, and you can see it from North Korea, and they're threatening to bomb them over that. So technically, were they right to do that? No. There was no credibility to the threat. Was it smart for them to do it? Actually, I think it was. It's probably one of the most brilliant moves Sony has ever had. Kim Jong-un is really helping out Hollywood now.
And technically, North Korea is still at war with South Korea over the
And
Korean
with us.
War. So, yeah. When I saw that they were pulling the movie, I had a similar reaction. I said, "This is the making of a cult classic, right here."
Exactly.
You know,
It has a 9.9 rating on IMDb right now.
I don't know. I don't know if they'll ever.
No one has seen the movie, and it's
Yeah.
rated 9.9.
I don't know if they'll ever recuperate their money, but this is a cult classic right here. And their careers, like, if they could be any bigger, they just exploded.
Pineapple Express, the international edition. Back to the original question, it's an act of cowardice, possibly marketing brilliance and cowardice. It is an act of cowardice. It's not an attack on free speech by any means. And this is one of those things that, for Sony, the damage has been done. They've already released the things that they've hacked through their emails and everything like that. So the damage has largely been done to Sony from hackers. They've pretty much, they've taken what damage they could. I don't know why you don't let this play out for a few days, don't make a decision, and then release the film next week.
Yeah, I think
on
that's
Thursday,
I think it was coming. I think one of the things they did wait on, I think that we did do due diligence, run the traps, see if there was any reason to believe that there were people going to blow up theaters. And today the president said that, he thinks there was a bad decision by them, which is, saying, we've it's all good.
Yeah,
we checked it out.
I mean, North Korea is not a...
We think you can show the movie. So I think in a few days, when it gets a little closer to Christmas and we're even more in the Christmas movie watching
they'll
season,
release the movie.
They will release the movie.
It's the term terrorist also gets me on this one, because North Korea, while a state run by a, like you said, a walking punchline, 3 generations of walking punchlines, it's not a terrorist threat. They can't project anything over the United States. They can't bomb theaters. They can barely feed their own people or gas up their warheads.
They are close to having miniaturized warheads to put on ICBM.
They do. They have regional.
They have neither the delivery mechanisms nor the resources.
They get one shot.
So as a great way to wrap this up, I'd say that we get a few benefits out of this. Sony's going to get a great benefit out of this once they will inevitably release the movie. It's not even a question at this point with how many people that are coming from this. And I see the benefit coming from this that we get a few extra North Korean jokes in.
late night comedy gold.
South Park is going to be all over this.
Okay, so finally, former Florida Governor Jeb Bush announced this week that he's actively considering running for president in 2016. Political commentators have noted that Bush has several advantages, being the brother of a former president and the son of another one. Others have pointed out that the Republican base is not thrilled with Jeb. Brian McNoll, how would you handicap Jeb's chances in the Republican primaries and a possible matchup with Hillary Clinton?
I think better chance than most people on the right give him right now, and worse chance that most people on the left give him. The Washington Post the next day was, rockets to the top of the Republican race. It's like, well, there's no one else is, we haven't coalesced behind the conservative candidate yet, right? Because he will be the moderate candidate. He holds the Mitt Romney space. Now, he will, fundraisers are racing down there to sign up. They want to pick, but their thing is to pick winners, and they're not afraid to move on later in the thing. So because they're there now, 2 years before the election, does not mean they'll be there when the election comes, or even by the primary time.
Well, that's why this announcement was so clever, was so smart, is because you put yourself on the donor map, so you start kind of gaining the loyalty. Our elections now, they're not elections, they're auctions. And so you put yourself on the donor map for these people, for the big Wall Street, donors. That's the people
the country club
that's
Republicans,
who he's really courting now. Exactly. And Wall Street loves Hillary, but it loves Jeb Bush even more.
It's a I agree. It's a tactical move. He sets himself up at the beginning. He's not currently in office, which means he doesn't have to actually take any positions and do anything other than set up a campaign apparatus and fundraise for 2 years. I mean, it's essentially a tactical move. It's a good one. I don't understand why he wants to run for president, because it seems like the most thankless job in the world. And then you might actually win, which seems even more thankless. But at the moment, yeah, it's campaign tactics, and it's a good one.
I think if he decides to run, he's the Republican establishment candidate immediately.
Well, the fact that he would be the Republican establishment candidate, along with the fact that he has a previous, that he has a brother and a father as a previous president, are his handicaps. People have still not gotten over the feeling of having George W. Bush as president. So that, of course, would factor into Jeb Bush's electability chances. Now, of course, he's going to try and position himself and say, like, oh, well, I'm not George W. Bush. Well, we've heard that before from our current president. But I would say that, though, Jeb Bush, and for WAPO to project him all the way to the top as soon as he makes that announcement is completely ridiculous to do. I don't even know why we're reading polls at this point. They're completely pointless. The election's way too far out to even say who really has the best chance of winning. Now, it would be interesting to note, though, that someone who has been consistently either at the top or near the top has not been Jeb Bush. It has not been any of the other candidates. It has been Rand Paul. And even Washington Post wrote an article talking about their possibilities and talking about who really has the best chance, not based on polls, but based on what they've done and what they've accomplished so far. Talking about their ability to relate to certain demographics, certain people, and they put Rand Paul right at number one. When it comes to things like Jeb Bush, if he were to be, he is the establishment candidate, and if he were to actually get nominated, I don't think he would ever win. He won't win. When you saw the election turnout from 2008 to 2012, you saw a big change. There were less people who turned out to vote for Mitt Romney than there were for even John McCain. And I put them as about the same for how much I really don't like them. But if you were to put Jeb Bush out there, I guarantee you would get an even less turnout than Mitt Romney.
I don't think so. The Bushes have. This is all about money now. I mean, our elections are all about money, and the Bushes have faithfully served Wall Street since the 30s. I mean, when Prescott Bush helped the rise of Hitler, actually helped finance the Nazis through Brown Brothers Harriman and Union Banking Corporation. So, but I want to mention a little bit of what Jeb Bush stands for. I mean, Jeb Bush is anti-abortion in all cases, including rape and incest. He's anti-gay marriage. He's anti-expansion of Medicare.
The Republican base is changing, though. It's not the Republican base of George W. Bush and Ronald Reagan.
And he's pro immigration reform. And so there's a whole side of the party he's not going to be able to talk to.
The Republican base is changing. Clear. If Jeb Bush was running for president in 1999, then yeah, I'd say he has a way better chance. But this is not the same electorate that it was in 1999. Jeb Bush, along with the Common Core thing, you have some big shifts happening in the Republican Party right now. You have people choosing sides that they weren't choosing before. And I know this comes from a biased standpoint of view because I'm a libertarian, but you can see the writing on the wall that those who share libertarian views or classical liberal views or even those who support things such as non-interventionism, people who can see that a lot of these things that we've been going by with the past couple of presidents, we can't afford to do anymore and we can't let them go on any longer. So I would say that Jeb Bush has a lot going against him, especially with the changing the way the electorate is actually working.
Yeah, I don't think that what he has said on immigration is that big a problem to him, because on the Republican side, immigration reform, immigration reform is a 70-30 issue. 70 are for it. So I don't think that kills him, but I think the Common Core and like the whole attitude behind that, big Washington controlling local life, will hurt him. It'll be hard for him to say he's not that. And that's the formula in the Republican primaries.
I think there's a huge populist reaction, and more than Republican versus Democrat, this is turning more into establishment versus anti-establishment. I don't see much of a difference between Jeb Bush and Hillary Clinton.
I agree.
But
that's also why I said that Hillary Clinton.
I see Elizabeth Warren on the other side, on the left. I see someone like Rand Paul who is becoming a little too establishment, even for libertarians.
I think he's been lined up for vice president.
Not in ideas. I hear that all the time because, of course, being in the libertarian crowd, I hear Rand Paul is a constant topic. Rand Paul is not really becoming establishment. He's just a smarter politician than his father. If you look at everything that Rand Paul has done up until he became senator, even when he first became senator, very much like his father. And it wasn't until, like, for instance, he talks about in his book, in his first book, The Tea Party Goes to Washington, he talks about his reaction, his entire go at it with Rachel Maddow over the Civil Rights Act. He was talking about how his position on property rights and things like that was becoming misconstrued on Rachel Maddow's show. And I think that kind of sent a signal to Rand Paul that he can't be like his father if he wants to get things done. It's not that he doesn't believe in these things. It's the fact that, and it's not the fact that he's not an anti-establishment. It's just he's a smarter politician.
Yeah, but that sounds a lot like the rationale for Obama. Obama was taking a lot of money from industry too.
The difference between Obama and Rand Paul.
And then people were trying to say, oh, well, that's not really what he stands for. He won't really honor those donations when it comes time. And we've seen how that turned out. Whereas Elizabeth Warren rejects corporate donations entirely.
No, she is all for the Export-Import Bank. She
look at her
talks
donations.
a great game.
Look at her donations. Wall Street despises her, and I can hardly think of a better criterion for a good president.
Couple of things. One, it's difficult to argue the logic of money controls politics and then predict an outsider intervention in the primaries in which money really is much more influential than in the general election. So I think that you're going to have to argue something else other than that if you're going to have an Elizabeth Warren, Rand Paul, either one of them making it through the primary and to become the nominee. For the second part, we're going to get a bit off topic onto the concept of Jeb Bush. And whether or not he's a viable candidate.
Shows how much people like Jeb Bush.
Well, he's hard to talk about because his advantage right now is he's pretty bland and everybody's kind of forgotten about him. And the only problem he has with that is the fact that he's got Bush's last name. And, it's been long enough that I think that that's going to be not a problem. He's going to have to pull an Al Gore with Bill Clinton and either embrace or run away from. But if he can pull that off and he can massage Common Core, he's got not a whole bunch of negatives and a fair amount of positives.
To what you said, elections are controlled by money, but there is a growing anti-establishment reaction.
Elections are not controlled by money. Elections are controlled by appeals to constituents. Money just helps you get the information out.
Exactly, which is all that matters.
Not
because in
particularly
today's
because there is
age
a
of
ton
amorphous
of free money.
politicians, that's essentially what controls the elections.
Politicians are much less amorphous than they used to be. They're actually much more definitive on political stances than they used to be. It is all true.
Disagree.
You can completely disagree.
Look at the poll numbers. Look at the poll numbers for Americans who say that the establishment, the political system, and the economic system no longer serves people like them. That number has nearly doubled since 2002. That is a growing populist reaction. And
it's not a growing populist reaction. It's a reaction to a
them.
long-term economic downturn, is what it is. It's a reaction to a recession. And
I think you're drawing a difference where it doesn't exist.
I think there's an undeniable
current
that the mainstream does not hold the answers. And it's to a degree that may not have been present in my lifetime. There's you have a chance for an Elizabeth Warren, a Ted Cruz, who is just as far off the mainstream on the other side. I think Paul is probably more a VP this time than a.
I would say about Ted Cruz is that more people like Elizabeth Warren than they like Ted Cruz.
I'm going to tell you something. Ted Cruz is the most powerful public speaker of anyone who is considering running for president. It may not, whatever you think of what he says,
he looks good
gripping speeches, holds audience in his hand. Guy who has the office now, what was his main qualification?
Okay. All right. So let's take some questions from our viewers. And I have a question from Lewis Griffin, and it stays on the last topic. Why should someone's last name disqualify him or her from being president?
I'm not saying it should, but the point is that the name carries weight. And when people hear Bush, they don't exactly think positive. So when you see Bush come onto the ticket, it's not because it should disqualify them. It's just because the name carries weight.
Yeah, and I think the benefits of switching to a democracy around the Age of Enlightenment about 200 years ago were escaping political dynasties, escaping the consolidation of control. And now you have George P. Bush also being groomed in Texas, so you've got like this endless lineage, and I simply don't think that's a democratic concept between the Bushes and the Clintons to have, if Clinton's elected, if she has an 8-year term, then 36 of the past 44 years will have been either a Bush or a Clinton. That's not a democracy.
And who knows what's going to happen after that?
If they all get voted in there, it's a democracy. I mean, just no one else comes up who can beat them. It's open to all of us.
If the money elects them. They've proven themselves to Wall Street.
Okay. And finally, let's take a question from Jessica Doyle. How much was the Cuba deal motivated by President Obama's smoking habit?
I would love to get my hands on some Cuban cigars, but I'm not really sure if President Obama's move was this decision because he wanted a really good cigar. You're basing your whole legacy off of a cigar. That's quite a
more
move.
About wagging the dog than smoking.
If that's the reason he made his biggest legacy decision, so be it.
Dominicans are almost as good and much easier to get a hold of.
Could you really imagine, though, that being the headline of his entire presidency in history?
Only if it was President Schwarzenegger. He might have changed Cuban policy for a cigar. But otherwise, I'm not sure.
And now it's time for the most underreported story of the week. Who would like to start?
I'll go first. All right, so a few days ago, Obama signed the Omnibus budget bill, which carried some profoundly undemocratic amendments. Several, like extending tax cuts to multinational corporations, but there's two in particular that I want to talk about. First, it crippled an already pathetic Dodd-Frank, the financial reform that was intended to prevent a repeat of the 2008 financial crash. To which was added a deregulatory amendment, literally written by Citibank, literally written by it. Second, it destroys the political contribution limit to parties. It raises it tenfold to $324,000 per election cycle. So if you're counting just national elections, that's $650,000 from a person every 2 years. That's insane. Add this to the rise of untraceable dark money, the super PACs created, and you've got an oligarchy. The next logical step is really just to kind of drop the pretense and abolish the FEC and coronate Clintons and Bushes, the kings of the United States.
I would like to join you in calling for abolishing the FEC. Start tonight.
That was sarcastic, by the way. That was sarcastic.
Brian, would you like to give your reported story?
My thing. In Vermont this week, they were very close when the legislature opened in January to passing full single-payer health care. The Democratic governor of the state backed down this week because he saw the cost, which would have been $4.3 billion overall. It would have required an 11.5% payroll tax and up to a 9.5% income tax. In other words, 21% of everybody's paycheck in New Hampshire or Vermont would have had to go to pay for single-payer health care. The governor said it's the greatest disappointment of his political career, but those costs are completely unacceptable. The other thing that happened there with that is, and it's already happened in other states too, the states that signed up for the Medicaid, expand Medicaid, more care for your, get this free federal money, right? The federal government, you've started the program, made the promises, and the federal government's already starting to dial back the amount of money. In the case of Vermont, they were supposed to give them $637 million. They whacked $150 million off of it. So it's $150 million plus $4.3 billion for this free government health care. And the governor's like, no, we cannot do that, and we're not going to try.
Well, it's free, so you get the bill.
Well, I mean, you know.
Okay, Nick, want to go next?
Oh, well, my underreported story for the week would be some of the families from the Newtown, Connecticut shooting deciding to sue Bushmaster for the manufacturer of their certain type of AR-15 rifle that was used during the Newtown, Connecticut shooting. And they're basing it off of sort of a type of negligence. They're trying to pass the liability of the of the use of the firearm in the shooting onto the company. I found the story, when I first saw the story, I thought it was an Onion article at first. I was like, you can't be honestly serious. You're really going to sue a company for the decisions of a single individual. And I kind of started looking into it, and I came to the conclusion, I'm like, well, if we can start doing that, then I guess we can start suing Cutco for every time someone's stabbed with one of their knives from one of their sets. And honestly, if any judge has any type of integrity, throw this case out, because it's absurd. I completely, I do sympathize with the families. It is a terrible tragedy to have happened. However, that is not the fault of Bushmaster or any other gun manufacturer in the country. If someone was shot with a revolver, would be the fault of Smith & Wesson? If someone was stabbed in that school by a knife, would that be the fault of Cutco? If someone got run over by a John Deere lawnmower, are we going to sue John Deere for that? Now, of course, if it's a mechanical fault, we're going to sue them for that. But if it's through human action, how can we sue a company for something that they did not? You can't possibly predict that is going to actually happen. So I can't possibly see their case.
Okay. And finally?
We used a 3D printer to mail a wrench to the International Space Station this week. That's
actually pretty cool.
That's amazing. NASA mailed a wrench to the International Space Station using a 3D printer. Government spending works.
Nice.
End of story.
We need a 3D printer that makes 3D printers.
3D printerception.
All right.
Exactly.
Nice to end on a positive note. All right, that's all for this week. Thanks for watching The Square Circle, and we'll see you next week.